Good morning, or depending when you're listening to this, good afternoon, good evening, or good night. My name's Ross, and I was always told I had a voice for radio, so I made a podcast all about the Pokémon trading card game. And you're listening to PTCG Radio. Now, this week we've got some interesting news, and I'm going to be honest with you, the majority of this podcast is going to be taken up with looking at the US National Championship results from 2015. Once again, I've had a good look at the results, and I've dug through them and done a whole bunch of analysis and picked out trends and thought of all the things that you need to mention, so that you guys don't have to. So you just get to sit back, make yourself comfortable, grab a nice cold drink or warm drink. I'm not here to make you drink what you want to drink. You know, you do what you want to do. And the main thing is you make yourself comfortable, and I tell you about the US Nationals results. But first, there is a little bit of news, and before we get to that, I want to give you my usual little, shall we say, shameless plug. Make sure you check out PTCG Radio on YouTube. Go to youtube.com/PTCG Radio. This week we've actually got an analysis of the Wailord deck, which went up and has proven to be a very popular video. It's gotten to 500 views in a day and a half, which is more than a lot of videos. Not every video, but more than a lot of videos. And there's been a lot of comments and discussion about that. And of course, I have uploaded the first 3 rounds from the Nottingham League Challenge after Lissandra's trump card was banned, and round 4 will probably be going up tomorrow, with round 5 going up at the end of the weekend. And of course, check out my video game channel, Wassy Plays, which is growing a little bit slower than I was hoping, but there's still plenty of time. It's the top featured channel on PTCG Radio, or just search Wassy Plays on YouTube. Go and check it out. It's just like PTCG Radio, except instead of talking about Pokemon, I'm talking about video games. And I spend much more time actually trying to make the videos edited and presentable. Although my new Wailord video, I don't mind saying, I put a bit of time and effort into that one, and I think it looks pretty good. Certainly the feedback so far has been pretty nice. So starting off then, in no particular order, the first thing I want to talk about this week is that in Japan, if you buy 2 boxes of the new set, you get a promo card. Now, this isn't new. Japan has always done this thing where if you buy 2 booster boxes of the new set, and in Japan, booster boxes are about half as big as our booster boxes, so it does make sense. However, the interesting thing here is that this promo card is a full art Skyla. It indeed looks like the full art Skyla that we got back in Boundaries Crossed. Now, those people who have been paying attention to the probable rotation, and I say probable rotation because as I've been making out for a while now, we have no confirmation of the rotation. Rotation for newer players, essentially after Worlds every year, certain sets are deemed ineligible for tournament play. So at the moment, you can use any set as of Boundaries Crossed, and it is expected that as of September, you will only be able to use sets from X and Y onwards in tournament play. Although remember, we have got the expanded format, which has been used a bit this year. It's not been used as much as we might think. So the question is it going to stay the same next year? Is expanded format going to go away? Probably not. Or is it going to be expanded and actually used more often? We don't know is the honest answer. You never know, they could do that. We had, when Lissandra's trump card was banned, there were some hints in that document, as I said a couple of weeks ago, and it referred specifically to X and Y on and to black and white on. So we can assume that expanded next year will remain black and white on, and we can assume that the rotation will be X and Y on. How much expanded is used, we don't know. So just because the Boundaries Cross cards, etc. rotate out, doesn't mean that you should just go and get rid of them. They may well be useful for expanded. But ignoring all of that, let's get back to this Skyla promo. Now, there's 2 questions that this brings up. Firstly, and this is a question to which most people have gravitated, does this mean that Skyla is now going to be reprinted in English and be legal for tournament play next year? Now, it wouldn't be coming out in Bandit Ring, our August set. It would be coming out in our November set. So assuming we have an XY on rotation, we can also assume that we're not going to have Skyla until at least November. A reprint in November, I wouldn't be terribly surprised. A lot of the really good trainers get reprinted. Juniper got reprinted and then got reprinted as Sycamore. And, you know, End's going away, but we're having a similar kind of supporter being reprinted. I think Lissandra's being reprinted, so it wouldn't be a huge shock if we saw a reprint of Skyla. I wouldn't say it's definite that we're getting a reprint of Skyla, but I would say it's more likely than not. Certainly one thing that we have seen a couple of times in recent memory is Japan's buy 2 boxes and get a promo card promo has actually been the same as our pre-release promo. It happened with the Tornadus EX a couple of sets ago. So I can't say one way or the other, but I would say it's more likely than not that we are going to be getting a reprint of Skyla. For my money, the more interesting question is, does anyone actually care? And I'm sorry if that sounds a little bit flippant, but how many of you use Skyla in your decks at the moment? Skyla was amazing. Back when we had a load of Stage 2 decks and we had Rare Candy and we had Tropical Beach, Skyla was an amazing card, if no other reason than getting Tropical Beach back. With no Tropical Beach at the moment, although promo cards rumoured, I'm not exactly sure what happened at US National. Someone hit me up on Twitter. It was supposed to be given out as a promo, but I've not actually heard anything yet, so somebody hit me up about that. But certainly the format we've got at the moment does not lend itself to Skyla. Nobody's playing it. It's like the new Lugia EX coming out. Everyone's looking at Lugia EX and going, oh my god, it's just like Mewtwo, it's going to be amazing. This is the Lugia EX, which is being printed in Bandit Ring, or Ancient Origins as it's being known in this country. But honestly, I mean, who's still playing Mewtwo? Now, in some metal decks and fairy decks that tend to get a lot of energy on the field, you often see one Mewtwo in there as a sweeper. A Pokemon where you can just essentially pile energy on it and sweep at the end of the game. Take your last KO or set up a couple of really big KOs that your opponent can't counter. But that's about it. We don't see a huge amount of Mewtwo. So why do people assume that Lugia is all of a sudden going to become amazing? Well, I say the same thing about Skyla. If people aren't playing it very much at the moment, what makes everybody think it's going to be somewhat more widely played when it's reprinted? And my answer is, I honestly don't think it's really going to. Now, I mentioned Emboar EX and Togekiss EX. These are being released in little Japanese decks that are coming out in the near future. We do now have translations of them. I'm not terribly impressed. I love Emboar as a Pokemon. As Emboar EX, not a huge fan. 180 HP, fire and a colourless, flip a coin until you get tails, 20 times the number of heads. So you've got a 50% chance of doing 0 and a 50% chance of doing 20 damage. For 2 energy, mind you. That then goes up to a 25% chance of doing 40 damage, a 12.5% chance of doing 60 damage, etc, etc, etc. It's not a very good attack. Or for 2 fire, 2 colourless, you can do 150 damage and discard 2 energy. It's not a terrible attack. It's fairly standard, to be honest with you. Weirdly, goes quite nicely with the Emboar from Legendary Treasures, the one that's got Inferno Fandango that allows you to put down as many fire energy cards as you want. But 150 for 4, discarding 2. It's the same attack that Dialga's got. So in a fire deck, it can be useful. But, you know, it's a decent attack, but it's not a great attack, shall we say. And certainly nobody's playing fire decks with loads of energy at the moment. Although remember, you've got things like Blacksmith, so I'm going to say there's at least potential in Emboar, but it's not amazing. Togekiss, the first attack does 20 damage for 1 fairy, and you get to attach an energy card from your hand to one of your Pokemon. I like the energy attachment, but there is the Geomancy Xerneas that we're not expecting to rotate that allows you to attach 2 energy from your deck rather than 1 from your hand. So if you want to be setting up, and it's a non-EX that only gives up 1 prize, and it's only got, I think, 40 less HP. So bearing all of that in mind, yeah, it's underwhelming. I'd rather just use Geomancy Xerneas. For 1 fairy, free colourless, 4 coins, 50 times the number of heads. If you want to pile a bunch of fairy energy on and do a bunch of damage, there's better attackers. First of all, you've got Gardevoir EX, Mega Gardevoir EX, does 30 times the number of fairy energy in play. So for 4 energy, you're doing a guaranteed 120. And then, of course, you've got Florges EX, which does more energy, dependent on how many fairy Pokemon you've got out. And, of course, now that we've got Skyfield, we can do a whole host of damage using Florges EX for just 2 energy rather than 4. So I'm not bowled over by this Togekiss EX. I'm not saying it's garbage. You get 4 energy on, you flip a few heads, you can do some damage, but it's not amazing. I mean, Florges does 20 times the number of grass and fairy Pokemon in play. Sorry, you have in play for 2 energy. So you fill your bench with a Skyfield, and you're doing 180 damage, 9 times 20, for 2 energy. And that's without a muscle band. So, if I was going for a hard-hitting fairy deck, I'd use Aromatisse, and then or you don't even need Aromatisse with Florges, to be honest. But it's Florges or Mega Gardevoir. They're both much better than They're both much better than Togekiss EX. I'd probably edit that out, but I'm not going to. Emboar EX, I think, is the better of the two, but even that one, Dialga has the same attack, essentially. 2 coloured energy, double colourless, 150 discard 2 energy. And what I'll say about that is, Dialga ain't lighting the format on fire, and that's in a Bronzong deck where the people are actually playing at the moment. People are preferring to go for the non-EX Heatran or Rayquaza or something along those lines, because of course you put 3 energy on a Rayquaza and you can be hitting for up to 240 damage rather than 150 for 4. Although you've got to have a full bench and a Skyfield to do 240. Although having said that, in order to do 150 with a Mega Rayquaza, you just need a bench of 5 and 3 energy. So, Emboar, he's just underwhelming, to be honest. He's not terrible, but as I keep saying, he's just underwhelming. Now, another cool piece of news, and this is really the last piece of news per se for this week, is that we are having a Pikachu EX. Now, I believe there was an Ash's Pikachu EX back in the day, or something along those lines. I forget exactly. It was before I started playing. Now, this is the first basic EX we've had in a while, and certainly it's an EX that evolves. And of course it's Pikachu. Pikachu breaks the rules all the time. But it's interesting that we're actually having this. We've seen things like, your Chandelure EX, which is a Stage 2. Heck, we've just seen Emboar and Togekiss EX, 2 Stage 2s. Excadrill EX, which is a Stage 1, but as a basic. But this is an actual basic that evolves, and it reflects that in the amount of HP it's got, 130. Having said that, Jirachi's got 90, Shaman's got 110. So, shall we say that it's not a problem if the attacks are good. Now, Iron Tail is basically a better version of Emboar's first attack. Flip a coin till you get tails, 30 times the number of heads, 1 colourless. Well, now you're doing it for 1 energy, so it's worth a punt, and it's 30 times, not 20 times, so already the first attack's better than Emboar. The second attack, however, now we're getting interesting. Overspark. Discard all lightning energy attached to this Pokemon. This attack does 50 damage times the number of lightning energy discarded in this way. So, minimum of 3 energy, lightning double colourless. So if you get 4 energy on Pikachu and discard them all, you're doing 200 damage to knock out non-EXs. Non-Mega EXs. You get 5 energy on Pikachu, you're knocking out Mega EXs. You get 3 energy on Pikachu, you're knocking out any Mega EX that's weak to lightning, like for instance Rayquaza. So I quite like that second attack. Now, in Expanded, we've got the Electric from Noble Victories, Bronzong but for Electric, which is weird describing it in that way, because when Bronzong came out, it was always Electric for Metal Pokemon, whereas now Electric's been out of the format except for Expanded for a while, and Expanded has not been widely played in tournaments. But everyone knows Bronzong, so now I'm describing Electric as a Electric Bronzong, which is kind of weird. So that is basically the attach a lightning energy from your discard pile to one of your bench Pokemon. So you can actually use that to power up Pikachu and hit for lots of damage. You could put Pikachu as a tech in a Manectric EX deck. Mega Manectric, remember, hits for 110 and attaches 2 energy, basic energy, from the discard pile to one of your bench Pokemon. And one of the big downsides of the Manectric EX deck is that you need a really big attacker, and sometimes you see a one-off Mewtwo there, just as your kind of big attacker to finish off the game. Well, Pikachu could be that attacker. Now, fighting weakness isn't great, especially with things like Landorus running around, although if it's rotated and you're playing in Standard, then Landorus isn't a problem. But even something weird like a Hawlucha with a Silent Lab to turn off his own ability, so that he then does hit for weakness, could then KO Pikachu with a Muscle Band or a Strong Energy. So he's weak, no doubt about it, and he gives up 2 prizes. But the first attack is a wonderful Hail Mary attack, just in a kind of, I've got nothing else to do, let's go flip some coins. And remember, you can use that Pokemon tool Trick Coin to allow you to reflip, because you're not going to need a Muscle Band, potentially, on Pikachu. Although, obviously, Muscle Band turns 150 into 170, which a lot of EXs have, and it turns 200 into 220, which a lot of Mega EXs have. But because you're doing energy based on the amount of, damage based on the amount of energy on Pikachu, then you can quite easily, take off the Muscle Band, put on a Trick Coin. I'm not saying that first attack is great, but I'm saying if it's your first turn of the game, or it's, if it's the end of the game, maybe you'll flip 4 or 5 heads in a row to get the win. It's unlikely, but it's for 1 energy, and in a game where you're absolutely losing, it's worth a punt. I would even be tempted to play a Trick Coin or 2 in this deck, but that's just me. So, that's Pikachu EX. Also, as a little piece of news, nothing terribly exciting, but both VGC and TCG, video game and trading card game, they both gave funky little mats to the competitors at US Nationals this past weekend. Which makes me wonder, where's my playmat? Well, actually, I did get a playmat from Nationals, but I got one of the standard Roaring Skies Deoxys ones. I didn't even get a staff mat. Sat in that room for 2 days commentating without a lunch break either day, presented trophies to the winners of VGC and TCG. Not enough for a staff mat. Didn't get a staff card either. Although I have lovely friends who have since hooked me up with a staff card and a staff mat. But, yeah, not greatly impressed by that I wasn't apparently staffy enough for them, despite being about the only member of staff that didn't have a lunch break both days. Although there were a couple of, people who similarly didn't, but most people did. Anyway, that's probably not the most important thing right now. These mats were cool. Bring them to UK Nationals, please. Now, before we get on to the results, I want to have a chat about a couple of things I saw on Facebook, Twitter, etc. shortly after US Nationals. Now, I saw a couple of people complaining, I got screwed by time. I would have made top 32, etc. if I hadn't been screwed by time. Now, very occasionally, you will be playing against someone who really slow plays you into a draw. I.e., you can play as fast as you want and they just play so slowly you end up drawing because you don't get enough games finished. Now, okay, but you can always call a judge. Now, sometimes, and I told you about my, if you go back to Cornwall Regionals, I think it was January or something we did them. In Cornwall Regionals, I actually had one game where the opponent was playing so ridiculously, and I mean kind of spends 2 minutes searching their discard pile and then just passes, when I later find out from the person sitting next to them, they had a hand of 2 unplayable cards. So they literally just sat there for 2 minutes doing nothing because they were going to win game 1. And when you call judges over, they don't just come and make them speed up magically. It takes time. They ask them to speed up, and then after a while they get a warning, etc. So I know it can be hard, but generally, play faster and learn when to scoop. If you lost game 1 and you're worried about time in game 2, you may well have had an opportunity to scoop earlier. It's something I talk about on a lot of my videos on YouTube. So get yourself over to YouTube, watch some of my videos for a lot of discussion on that. I have a bit of sympathy there, but not very much. The one I really have no sympathy for, and this is an argument which is starting to make me actively a little bit angry, and somebody actually put on Facebook, my daughter should have made Top Cut, but she was screwed out of Top Cut because her opponent didn't scoop to her. That's right, ladies and gentlemen. My kid would have made Top Cut if their opponent didn't scoop. You know what? Your kid would have made Top Cut if they'd won the game. And this is an argument I hear quite a lot. Oh, it's going to go to time and I can make Top Cut and they can't, so they should give me the win rather than going to a draw. I can make Top Cut if I win, but they can't make Top Cut if they win, so they should scoop to me so I can make Top Cut because they've got nothing to gain. Let me just say this argument one last time. In a top 8, there are 8 spots for Top Cut. 8 people are going to make Top Cut. And it doesn't matter if it's you or your friend or somebody you've never met. Somebody is going to make Top Cut. What that means is, if your opponent had been nice and scooped to you, or your child or whoever, you would have made top cut. And somebody else would have not made top cut. It is not nice to scoop someone into cut. Because while you're being nice and scooping one person into cut, you're being horrible because you are simultaneously scooping somebody else out of cut. Brilliant. Now they don't make top cut because you scoop to your opponent. Now don't get me wrong, if I'm playing my good friend Tommy Roberts or a similarly chumful friend of mine, absolutely I might scoop them into cut. But that's not some kind of great moral argument, it's just I like my friends, I want them to do well. And if I can help them to do well in some way, I will. I have had friends scoop me into top cut before. It's happened 2 or 3 times. I've never asked for it, but I have had people scoop me into top cut. Only ever very good friends of mine. No random strangers, not when I ever ask them to. So can we please, ladies and gentlemen, put this argument to bed once and for all? Your opponent isn't being mean to you if they refuse to scoop you into top cut rather than taking a tie or if they couldn't make cut. Because if they're being nice to you, they're being mean to somebody else. And it seems like after every big tournament now, the entitled people come out and start arguing, I should have made top cut, but somebody didn't scoop to me and blah, blah, blah. Win your games, mate. So, going into US Nationals, now what I've done, and I'm afraid I didn't write down their name, so I do apologise, but on the popular Facebook group Verbank City Gym, I wonder if they're going to change the name after rotation. There were some lovely people who collated the top 64 of US Nationals, just names and decks. So what I've gone through and I've basically collated these and I've tried to draw some trends. Now, as always, and I say this every time I collate results together, I've had to make some decisions along the way here. I have had to group decks together. So, for instance, there are some Seismitoad Garbodor decks, some Seismitoad Crobat decks. I have put them all under the guise of Seismitoad, because they are essentially Seismitoad decks. The vast majority of the game is spent using Quaking Punch and stopping your opponent playing. Now, some decks will use Garbodor to shut up abilities, some decks will use Crobat to do a bit of extra damage, but they both have essentially the same thing. Similarly, some Manectric decks have, Garbodor, some have Landorus, some have Suicune, some have Ninetales. But if they are predominantly Manectric decks, I'm putting them all together. I've seen some websites, and the websites I use and have a lot of respect for, who have tried to really break these decks down, especially Manectrics, and you end up with results from which you can't draw any trends. The only time I've really struggled is Raichu decks. I'm going to apologise for that now. Decks which I believe to be predominantly Raichu, I have put as Raichu decks. But the fact of the matter is, the majority of them also had Landorus and or Seismitoad. And it may well be that although I'm seeing them as Raichu decks, they might actually be Seismitoad decks with a 2-2 Raichu line in for some particular matchups. That's the only trouble that I've had, so you'll have to forgive me for that. Now, one thing that isn't really trouble but is a conscious choice, Manectric and Seismitoad. I have got 3 topics here, or 3 categories. I've taken Seismitoad, Manectric, and then Manectric and Seismitoad, purely because they were actually the 3 of the 4 biggest decks, and I think that Manectric Toad is sufficiently different to Toad or Manectric without it, and, crucially, all 3 decks were represented in high enough numbers. So first things first, I'm just going to run you through the winning, or the top 64 decks. We had 12 Seismitoad decks without Manectric, 9 Manectric decks without Seismitoad, and then we had 6 Manectric Toad and 6 Rayquaza. Or if you want to look at it another way, you could look at it as 18 Toad or 15 Manectric. Either way, Toad and Manectric rising up above the other decks. And again, we have to look in terms of making top cut and getting deep into top cut and winning. But certainly, at this last weekend's US Nationals, the evidence is unequivocal. The 2 decks that gave you the best chance of getting into the top 64 because there's 2 flights, each has a top 32, is Seismitoad and Manectric. But also of relevance and slotting nicely into the third place, Rayquaza with 6 top 64 spaces. And these are my kind of top 3 decks, if you will. Toad, Manectric, Rayquaza. Moving on into my kind of, I suppose you can call it tier 2 if you want. But these were the kind of a bunch of top cuts, but not all that many. We had 4 Raichu-based decks, 3 Landorus-based decks, although again, a lot of Raichu had Landorus in. 3 Night March decks, 3 Wailord decks, 3 Plasma Clang decks, and 3 Metal decks. And then the kind of occasional top cuts, but nothing to worry about too much. 2 Kyogre, 2 Groudon. There's something nice about the fact that we had 2 Kyogre and 2 Groudon. Like they're kind of locked in this battle for which one's better and nobody can quite decide. 1 Archie's Blastoise, 1 Flareon, 1 Hippowdon, 1 Donphan, 1 Bunnelby. Huge props to that chap. 1 Lucario Bats, 1 Trevenant, and 1 Yveltal. So, let's look a little bit closer at some of these. Manectric and Toad I've kind of talked about, and I'm going to talk more about Toad in a minute. But as for Manectric, it's just efficient. 20 to the active, 20 to the bench for 1 energy, 60 to the active or 120 if they've got a tool for 2 energy, and bearing in mind they've either got a tool or they want to put a tool but they're deliberately not putting down a tool and harming their deck to not give you the extra damage. I'm fine with that. And then when you get the Mega 110 and for 2 energy, and then you get to attach 2 basic energy to one of your bench Pokemon. It is very efficient and it perpetuates itself. So you get 2 of these bad boys out and get end, it's really not the end of the world. The other thing that Manectric has going for it is a Rough Seas Stadium, which allows you to heal 30 damage per turn from each of your lightning or water Pokemon. We also saw this in Kyogre decks and the like. Really, really good stadium, and it really helps with Manectric. An awful lot of the Manectric decks were also playing Ninetales this past weekend. It's really the first weekend where Ninetales has been really widely played. And there's a very good reason for that. Ninetales has an ability which stops your opponent replacing the stadium. And as I've mentioned, Rough Seas in Manectric decks is ludicrously good. So you really need it to stay on the field in order to make this deck more competitive. And I don't think it's a coincidence that the weekend that the Manectric players really start playing Ninetales is the same weekend where Manectric really has a bit of a resurgence, or arguably has the most success it's ever had. I mean, clearly the second best Pokemon around which to base your deck after Seismitoad. Now, in terms of the third best Pokemon, Rayquaza, one of the things which I find very interesting is that out of the 6 Rayquaza decks that made top 64, only one of them was the speed version with Shaymin. 5 of them were Bronzong. And this kind of goes with what I said recently, which is that the Rayquaza deck, if you go for the speed build, you end up running into the situation where if you miss the early speed, you're a little bit screwed. Not only that, but you then have a very linear kind of one plan deck, and if the plan falls down, safeguard Pokemon or etc., then you run into trouble. Bronzong, and also it's very susceptible to N. Bronzong kind of gets around that by basically saying, well, it's alright, if you get your Rayquaza knocked out, Bronzong can attach Metal Energy from the discard pile and attach it to the Rayquaza. So it helps you to stream Rayquazas quicker, it makes you more end-proof, it slows the deck down a little bit, but it makes it into a better deck overall. I certainly think it's a better way to play it, and that's been proven out this weekend. One thing I have seen, and I can't say I have not seen all top 64 lists, but one thing I will tell you is that a lot of these Bronzong decks don't appear to be playing Altaria, which makes Rayquaza susceptible to electric attackers like your Raichu, like your Manectric. And that's something people need to be a little bit careful of, because it certainly seems like that might explain one reason why Manectric was such a good play this weekend. Now, I'm not going to stop and look at every deck. Wailord we'll look at later. Night March, it's interesting that there were only 3 top 64s with Night March, but Night March has always been one of those decks which it's susceptible to ties, as I mentioned previously, and it can lose some games very quickly, making it hard to win a best-of-3 series and perpetuating the amount of ties that it gets. One thing which did impress me was there was a bit of a resurgence of Plasma Clang this past weekend. Now, Plasma Clang is, I think it was a Plasma Storm Kling Clang. And the Plasma Storm Kling Clang had this wonderful ability whereby it basically made all of your Pokemon immune to damage from EXs. Now, it's a stage 2 that you've got to have on the field for it to work, and it will obviously be, well, it'll be turned off by Wobbuffet, but then you have to get Wobbuffet to the bench to attack with an EX, so Wobbuffet's essentially irrelevant. Goes through Silent Lab, so it's only Garbodor that turns it off. Prevent all damage done to your Metal Pokemon by attacks on your opponent's Pokemon EX. And then, of course, you can use Bronzong if you want, and you can use Cobalion EX and Dialga EX and etc, etc. Heatran, Cobalion, all those good things. All the same attack as you'd use in a Metal deck. But they've essentially all got Safeguard. Not only have they all got Safeguard, but a lot of decks now play 1 or 2 Silent Lab to get around things like a Suicune or a Sigilyph with Safeguard. That won't help against Kling Clang. Now, it's a deck which was in vogue a couple of years ago now. I think it was Charlie Powell and Tamao Cameron. I believe it was Worlds 2013. They both made top 32 at Worlds by using this Kling Clang deck. But unfortunately, doesn't seem to have had much of a resurgence. But 3 spots in top 64, that's pretty gosh darn cool. The Metal deck also got 3 spots in the top 64, but I talked about that in a lot of detail last week, so I don't want to go into that too much. Now, when we get down into the 1 prize, but I was like kind of like the 1 decks, the decks that had 1 representative in top 64, now it's getting kind of fun, because here, and I've said this before, it's not really enough to assume that these are good decks. When you get down to the 1 spot in top 64, you're saying 1 person out of 900 made top cut with this deck. So maybe you're talking an exceptional player. And it was actually, Bunnelby Lock was Harrison Levin, who I believe came second at Worlds in 2012. So, yeah. So essentially what we're saying here is that these decks, it might be 1 person had a good list, or you have an exceptional player, or they might even have just seen a lot of good matchups that weekend. And certainly the Bunnelby Lock ended up down at 63rd. So it made it, but it only just made it into top 64. So, let's have a look at some of these more interesting decks. Archie's Blastoise. Now, the weird thing about Archie's Blastoise is that it got up to 15th. Now, it didn't make the top 8, but it made top 16. That is hella good, ladies and gentlemen. And this is essentially your classic Blastoise deck with one huge difference. Instead of trying to go Squirtle, Rare Candy, Blastoise, the entire deck is built around using Archie's Ace in the Hole, which is a supporter whereby you play it as the only card in your hand, and then you get to put a water Pokemon on your bench, even if it's not a basic, and draw 5 cards. So you get Blastoise out by that mechanism. It's a deck people have been thinking about and talking about ever since Primal Clash came out, but it's not a deck I've heard having much success. So again, this seems like one player has just made a really good deck and just played it really, really well. Very interesting deck. Played it a lot with Keldeo as well. He was saying that he got the turn 1 Blastoise about 80% of games, and he got a turn 1 Sacred Sword for 170 in about, half of those, so about 40% of his games. That's pretty gosh darn good going, if you ask me. 1 Flareon deck made top 64, and I want Flareon to be good. I really want Flareon to be good. Now, whether it is going to continue to be good, I don't know, ladies and gentlemen. I mean, certainly we're expecting it to rotate out, but Vespiquen's coming in, and I think cards like Unknown are going to make Vespiquen even better than Flareon was. But let's talk about Vespiquen in a couple of weeks when we got a bit more time. 1 Donphan deck made top 64, and I talked about him on last week's podcast as well. Now, I believe I made clear, and I at least I hope I did, Donphan is not the best deck around at the moment. He's just a wonderful, wonderful Pokemon. He's in the PTCG Radio logo for a reason, ladies and gentlemen. So, I love Donphan, but let's make it very clear, he's not the best kind of Pokemon. Now, very, very good against Manectric decks, which was the second best deck, but terrible against Seismitoad, the top deck, and Rayquaza, the third deck. Can struggle against Landorus Bats decks, can't really beat Wailord, but then it's really good against Night March and Klinklang. So, I think Donphan was probably underrepresented. I think Donphan was one of those decks where you needed a bit of luck, but there were plenty of good matchups for Donphan. Manectric, some Landorus decks, Raichu, Night March, Klinklang, etc. But there were also plenty of bad matchups, notably, of course, Toad and Rayquaza, and, of course, Kyogre. So, let's not get too excited too quickly about this. And there was one Trevenant and one Yveltal, but we've talked in recent weeks about the fact that they're not as good as they have been. And the last two decks I want to talk about, firstly, Hippowdon. Now, I don't want to go into too much detail about Hippowdon, purely because I have already uploaded a video to my YouTube channel where you can see Hippowdon in action. No, I'm lying to you, I haven't done that yet. But I have uploaded a wonderful video showing the Dutch national champion Benji Pham playing Fighting Bats against a lovely chap called Jeff Tallman playing Hippowdon from round 4 of this Nottingham League Challenge. So I encourage you all to... It's going to go up online. I reckon tomorrow I'm going to get it online. So I encourage you all to go and have a good gander at that. And you'll see how the Hippowdon deck works. But it's one of these cards kind of like Sizor. When you attack with it, and it's a stage 1 and it takes a fighting double colourless. It does 60 damage, but of course you've got your Strong Energy Muscle Band Fighting Stadium with which you can add to the damage. But more importantly, it stops your opponent's EX from hitting you. So you play against a Rayquaza deck, you hit him for, 40 with resistance, but then they've got to get a Lysandra, or they're not hitting you. And it's the same kind of idea as the Klinklang deck I just mentioned, or indeed your safeguard Pokemon like Suicune and Sigilyph. A lot of decks nowadays are very EX heavy. Think Seismitoad, think Manectric, think Rayquaza, etc. In fact, all the top 3 decks were very EX heavy. Although Manectric, it's very easy to put non-EX attackers in there, given that you can accelerate energy with Mega Manectric. So these EX blocking decks have had a little bit of a resurgence. And finally, Harrison Levin playing Bunnelby, making top 64 at US Nats. I love that man for doing that. It's brilliant. Bunnelby, remember, has got the attack where you get to discard a card from your opponent's deck, and he's got the ancient trait where he can attack twice per turn. Also makes it impossible to deck out, because you've also got the second attack for 1 energy, which allows you to put a card from your discard pile into your deck. And again, you can do that twice. So ironically, this Bunnelby deck would have run through Wailord. So, there are 2 things out. Now, I'm going to have a very quick look at the top 8. I'm less worried about the top 8. Because honestly, by the time you get up to here, it's a win here or there. But just looking at the top 8, from 8th upwards, in 8th place we had eventual winner Jason Kaczynski with Seismitoad. In 7th, Jeffrey Salk with Rayquaza Bronzong. 6th, Enrique Avila, the eventual runner-up with Wailord. 5th, we had Christy Britton with Manectric Seismitoad. 4th, we had Ben Moscow with Metal. 3rd, we had Eduardo Gonzalez with Hippowdon. That's right, the one Hippowdon in Top Cut came 3rd. 2nd, we had Manectric. And 1st, we had Klinklang. The number 1 seed was playing Klinklang. So, we see a bit representative there. Only one Seismitoad in top 8. We had a couple of... we had one Seismitoad, one Manectric, and one Seismitoad Manectric. We had a couple of Metal. We had a Klinklang, a Hippowdon, a Rayquaza, and a Wailord. So a nice kind of mix of decks there. And you should expect to see this. There was no overarching best deck dominating this year. The closest we had was Seismitoad and Manectric. And it makes sense that 3 of the top 8 spots was taken up with Manectric and or Seismitoad. And then we had a little sprinkling of other decks. And then we got down to the final, which was Enrique Avila's Wailord deck, falling to Jason Klaczynski's Seismitoad Garbodor deck. Although, and if you haven't watched the stream, go to twitch.tv/Pokémon. You can. They've archived the US Nats into 3 videos, one from Friday, one from Saturday, one from Sunday. In Sunday's stream, you can see the final, and I encourage you to watch it. It sounds really boring. It was thrilling. But more importantly, you can see that Jason Klaczynski only won because time ran out. Jason Klaczynski lost Game 1 after taking 5 prizes. Game 2, he'd taken 5 prizes. He was not going to take a 6th prize, and then time ran out. Now, had that been a Swiss round, Enrique wins, but it wasn't. It was Top Cut. And the rule in Top Cut is if you've taken 4 prizes or more, the game counts, or if somebody has. As Jason had taken 5 prizes, he wins Game 2. They go to sudden death, and Wailord ain't winning in sudden death. So Jason Klaczynski wins the national championship for the first time after 3 Worlds wins. But let's make it very clear, ladies and gentlemen, time played a big factor. In an untimed game, we've got Wailord winning nationals. So, I want to talk about those 2 finalists, and then we're going to pretty much wrap it up today. So, Seismitoad, and again, Jason Klaczynski is this season either the best or the second best player in the world. Chase Maloney and Jason Klaczynski are the best players in the world this season. And there's other people like Christy Britton, I would argue Ryan Morehouse in the UK, who are getting up there with them. A couple of other European players as well who are crushing it. But I don't think there is anyone that's coming close to Chase Maloney and Jason Klaczynski. Interestingly, for some reason, Worlds and National Drafts are becoming popular nowadays. I suppose it's kind of like fantasy football. Draft those 2 people, because I would be surprised, honestly, if they didn't both make top 8 of Worlds this year. But I would be genuinely stunned if top 8 of Worlds had neither of them in. They should be a number 1 and 2 seeds for drafts. I'm not, let's make it clear, it does sound like the kind of thing I'd spend way too much time researching and then do a podcast on. But as it stands at the moment, I am not planning on doing a podcast telling you who to draft in your Fantasy Worlds draft. But I will say, draft those 2 number 1 and 2. If you don't, you're silly. So one thing we've got to point out here is that Seismitoad had a good weekend, not an all-encompassing weekend like it did at, for instance, UK Nationals and all the other Nationals where Lissandra's trump card wasn't banned. But you've got to remember that Jason Klaczynski is that next level kind of player whose deck building skills and playing skills are a cut above the rest. But the thing about Seismitoad is, trump card gets banned and everybody goes, whoa, hang on a second. I can't play it like I used to, now it must be terrible. The fact of the matter is, Trainer Lock is still ridiculously strong. Trainer Lock combined with Hypnotoxic Laser is awesome. Trainer Lock combined with Hypnotoxic Laser and Burbank City Gym is one of the stupidest combos we've seen since I've been playing. You then add in Shaman for draw power and consistency, and Garbodor to shut off abilities, and you're looking at a deck which is stopping you playing Trainer, shutting off abilities, and leaving you poisoned and a quarter of the time asleep. That's a hell of a deck, ladies and gentlemen. And again, and this comes back to what I said about Chase Maloney, I think it was last week after Canadian Nationals. Good players, I mean really good players, like Chase, like Jason, they tend to gravitate towards these decks which aren't amazing. For instance, Rayquaza, you are going to have games where you crush your opponent and games you can't win. Wailord, you're going to have games where you crush your opponent and games where you can't win. Seismitoad has very few games where you're going to crush your opponent. But it basically has no games other than maybe Vrizzy and Genesect, which didn't get a single top 64. Think about that last year at Worlds, when it was crushing Worlds with something like 3 of the top 8 or something stupid, maybe more than that. And now consider, maybe 5 of the top 8, something ridiculous. And now consider that it didn't make top 64 at Nationals just a few months after it was winning everything, or at least winning a lot. So it's a kind of deck where really good players pick it up like Metal, and they go, haven't got any amazing matchups, but I ain't going to be losing very much. There's no real auto losses going on here. And finally then, Wailord. Let's talk about the elephant in the room, or indeed, the whale in the room. You're welcome. I wasn't watching the US Nat stream live. I was at home in Cornwall with my girlfriend and, you know, spending time with a girlfriend, running around, seeing family, doing the kind of things that couples do. So I was watching the stream throughout the weekend, whenever I could get 5 minutes, and then binging the last kind of 6 hours after work on Monday. But I was occasionally flicking on Facebook. I was getting messages from people essentially along the lines of, what do you think about Wailord then? And it's one of those things, I don't know if it was a joke or not. Now, I first heard about Wailord. I've got a good friend, Emmanuel De Silva. He's going to be on the podcast hopefully before... In fact, I'm going to get him on the podcast before World this year. He's going to talk to us. An amazing player. I believe he's made top 22 in Europe, so he's getting a paid invite straight to day 2. He's an amazing player. And he was telling me... I was hearing his rumours about Wailord a little while ago. So I went to him and I was just like, right, dude, what is it about this Wailord deck? And he told me essentially, look, Ross, it's a joke. I want to make this Wailord deck using Rough Seas and a whole bunch of healing, and I want to take it to Top Cut, just so that we can have Top Cut matches that last forever. Because, of course, Top Cut, you've got to have a winner. If the game's tied, you just keep going. And he thought it would be hilarious to just have a Top Cut game going on for hours. Now, I have seen 20-minute Top Cut games with Durant before. I think I saw a Top Cut game one time. I think it might have been my friend Alex Holdway, who actually decked someone out in sudden death with Durant, which is just phenomenal. But anyway, and that's how I heard about Wailord. And like everybody, Wailord's released. It's got 250 HP on a regular EX, not a Mega. And you look at that and go, oh my god, I wish it was good. But the ability's garbage, the attack's garbage, nobody cares. Oh, actually, the ability's alright. Now, what's interesting is that now it's become a good deck, and it's all because Lissandra's trump card has been banned. So here's the deal with Wailord. It plays no energy, it never attacks, and it attempts to deck out your opponent. You play healing cards like the aforementioned Rough Seas, AZ, a supporter card that allows you to pick up a Pokemon and discard all cards attached to it. Cassius allows you to shuffle the Pokemon and cards attached to it into your deck. You play Hard Charm to reduce 20 damage, etc. And you keep your Wailords alive for as long as possible. You use Hard Charm and Rough Seas to keep Wailord alive, and then you use Max Potion, AZ, and Cassius so that when it's about to die, you heal it off completely. You then play disruption cards like Team Flare, Grunt, and Zerasic, and Enhanced Hammer, and all of that to stop your opponent essentially playing. You Lissandra up stuff that can't retreat, you get rid of all your opponent's energy, and they deck out in a very long, slow game. It's a rubbish deck, and I've had a bunch of messages from people this week. One of the things I love about this podcast, by the way, is that I do just get random messages on Twitter, by email, ptcgradio@hotmail.co.uk, or on my YouTube videos. I just get messages from people giving me their opinions, which I love, because clearly I do this podcast because I've liked the Pokemon trading card game way too much. And a lot of people have basically been saying to me, I hate this deck. And people telling me it goes against the spirit of the game. Now, I don't know if I agree with them, but you certainly can't mock them for that opinion. It's a totally valid opinion. People don't like this deck. It's polarizing. But the fact of the matter is, it's a very interesting, very, very innovative deck. Now, it's not a fun deck against which to play. But the thing that kind of amused me is that people would have gone to Nationals, and, round one, you sit down, your opponent flips over a Wailord. And we shouldn't. But every time we see somebody flipping over a card that we don't see in professional play or tournament play very often, our first thought is, new player, not got a great deck, easy win. And if you're really obsessive like me, you think, ooh, this might be an easy win, but it might screw up my resistance if it comes down to it later on. Bad thinking, we all do it, let's not pretend we don't. And then you get decked out by Wailord. And if you get decked out in game one that takes 35-40 minutes, you are going to sit there panicking. Because if you don't finish game 2 in Swiss, the game doesn't count. You can take 5 prizes and your opponent's taken none and the game doesn't count. So, a very interesting deck. And it works for 2 reasons. Firstly, Lissandra's trump card has been banned. And it means that your opponent can deck out now. And I watched a stream at Nationals this past weekend. Like I said, I saw a lot of people decking out or getting very close. It's like in the short time we've had Lissandra's trump card in the format, people have forgotten that you can deck out. Because I see people playing way more cards than they need to, and then decking out a few turns later. And I made a similar point when we had trump card and people were playing Shaman. They were going Shaman for 1, Shaman for 2, Shaman for 1, Shaman for 1 in one turn. Save your resources, people. Unless you desperately need something. But I was seeing these Seismitoad Shaman decks. They had the DC, they had the laser, they had the muscle band, they needed nothing. And then they play 3 more Shamans for 1 or 2 cards each, and then just attack anyway. It's a waste of resources. So my first tip, well, not my first tip, we're 50 minutes in, but one tip I'll give you people today, you lovely people, is learn to look after your resources, because decking out is a real thing nowadays, and it happens, and it's sad. So, if you want to know more about the Wailord deck, I did a video about this. It's on my YouTube channel. Now, I know I might mention the YouTube channel more and more recently, and there's a very good reason for that. I'm posting more and more. I'm using my YouTube channel a lot more. Essentially, I'm using it largely as an extension of the podcast. The podcast is still my first love, but the fact of the matter is I've done an 18-minute video about Wailord, and I'm not going to be doing 18 minutes on Wailord in today's podcast. So I get to I get to give so many more opinions and stuff on YouTube, which is why I do that. Now, it's the second video I've done recently where it's everyone's talking about it, let's knock up a quick video. The last one I did was when Lissandra's trump card was banned. And an awful lot of discussion, a lot of views very quickly. People seem to like these videos, so feel free to request more of these in the future. They seem to be going well. And of course, if you haven't subscribed, youtube.com/PTCGRadio. And gosh darn it, go check out Wassy Plays. Now, this podcast gets listened to about 800 times a week, although there's bound to be some duplicates over the different formats. But even so, a bunch of you listening haven't checked out Wassy Plays, and that makes you terrible people. But I'll forgive you if you go and subscribe right now. Done? Good. The last thing I will say about Wailord is it's kind of had its moment in the sun. Now, what I'll say is, go back to 2 years ago, Gothitelle. Gothitelle was this deck that basically blocked trainers and kind of cleaned up. And it was a very innovative deck, and it came around at Nationals and it won everything. But the problem was, everyone was prepared for it come Worlds. And the few that turned up didn't do well. Like John Robert III's Kling Clang deck. This was way back. This was a Kling Clang that could move energy from black and white, which you could still play and expanded. From way back in 2012, the year I was at Worlds, he won Nationals with it, took the same, because essentially he was saying it was a deck that revolved entirely around special energy. And he basically played a deck that if nobody was playing Lost Remover, like Enhanced Hammer, but it put it in the Lost Zone rather than the discard pile, if nobody's playing Lost Remover, this deck is awesome. If they're playing Lost Remover, I'm screwed. Nobody played Lost Remover. He won US Nationals. Went to Worlds, went 4-4. Whoops. But these are the kind of things that happen. It might have been 4-3. I think it was a 7-round tournament. We went 4-3. Because everyone was playing Lost Remover again. And then we flick forward to 2013, and I told you that my friends Charlie and Tamau made Top Cut with Kling Clang, and the reason was Gothitelle basically auto-won Kling Clang because it was a non-EX attacker and Kling Clang preyed on EX decks. So what happened was that you get around to Nationals, Gothitelle wins, nobody plays Kling Clang because they're scared of Gothitelle. Comes around to Worlds, everyone's prepared for Gothitelle, nobody plays Gothitelle, Kling Clang's really good again and gets both my friends into top 32. Now, that brings me to my kind of conclusion on Wailord. It's very easily countered. The easiest counter, and again, more detail on this in my YouTube video, the easiest counter for Wailord is Bunnelby. Bunnelby, okay, now some people are saying just sit there and use the attack that discards a card from their deck and deck them out. You can do. Use a second attack. You cannot deck out if you use that Bunnelby, because you essentially put 2 cards back into your deck every turn. So every turn you can draw 1, put 2 cards back into your deck. And if you've got energy in your deck, you've got to draw into the energy before you are unable to draw a card, and then you just put more energy back into your deck. Your opponent cannot deck you out there. So, and it is, of course, for 1 colourless energy. So essentially, anyone can put 1 Bunnelby into their deck, and as long as your opponent doesn't discard it with Trick Shovel or something like that, or it's prized and you don't take it out the prizes, you can't lose to Wailord. There's other counters, of course, but that's the kind of main thing. It's 1 card. If you're really worried about it at Worlds, stick 1 Bunnelby in your deck. Now, there's also situations where maybe on the first turn of the game, you're playing Seismitoad, you have to Juniper 2DC, get them back with Bunnelby. Might be that you're behind in a game and you don't think you're going to win, but you can use Bunnelby for a couple of turns to discard some cards from your opponent, and then they deck out. Maybe you're playing a Groudon deck and you've got to leave Summing active for a couple of turns, so you use Bunnelby to discard a bunch of cards from their deck while you set up your Groudon. Bunnelby is a really good Pokemon. So it's not... For instance, if we use a Durant example, they printed the Heatmore, which basically KO'd Durant for 1 energy, but was utterly useless in every other matchup. And not everyone's... Ironically, no one ever played Heatmore. It was Darkrai that really killed off Durant. So you get this Heatmore coming out, and everyone's going, whoa, that beats Durant, but I'm not playing it. Whereas Bunnelby, it can be useful in every game in a tournament. And that, ladies and gentlemen, I reckon will just about do it for this week. Again, if you want to tweet me about anything I've said, tell me I'm a liar, call me an idiot, or maybe even say nice things if you're feeling in a charitable mood, you can tweet me at the Wassy. You can email me at ptcgradio@hotmail.co.uk. And, of course, check out my YouTube channel, youtube.com/PTCGRadio, and look on the feature channel and check out Wassy Plays as well. Go and check out my Wailord video that I posted just yesterday. And look out for the round 4 from the Nottingham League Challenge, featuring this Hippowdon deck I keep telling you about, which should be online tomorrow, and then round 5 from that tournament, which will be online, I reckon Sunday. That one will be going up. Look after yourselves till next week. Thank you very much for listening. My name's Ross, and you've been listening to PTCG Radio.